All right. Hi, Carl Tolbert. I went to CIU, actually, Columbia International University. I went through the organizational leadership program. I got a lot of questions about how I did my literature review. I had taken a kind of a different approach. By nature, I'm a machine designer by trade as well as a programmer. And I took more of a systemic approach to a literature review. And I wanted to share my process because it's when I was going through the doctoral program, it was very disjointed as far as the information, not from the university, but just in general. It's one of these things like, how do you get started? What's the process? It just didn't exist clearly to me. So I created this little PowerPoint, and I'm going to do a little demo with this as well. So great stuff. All right. So the hermeneutic literature review. Now, what hermeneutics is, I included that because that actually is the process. It's a kind of a circular thing where you're searching and analyzing and repeat in multiple rounds. And this was my process. Now, the big thing, don't let hermeneutic scare anyone, because often it's associated with like religious research, like studying the Bible, and then you're trying to take the interpretation of that when it was written at that time, to a modern day, interpretation, just like law books or any kind of historical documents. And it's one process, but in this case, it's vastly different. So what this means, however, is that when you look at qualitative design, specifically phenomenological, you had the Husserl versus the Heidegger-Gadamer versions. And really what it came down to was transcendental, which bias was bracketed, objectively disseminated away to give more of a clear answer, as unbiased as possible to any type of qualitative research. The other side is the hermeneutic design, which bias isn't necessarily discarded. It's actually part of the process and it's observed as such. So it's just a different approach. Now, since literature reviews specifically require the researcher to have a certain sense of bias because you're selecting what to include and what not to include, what to compare, which things are relevant and which things are not, that's why the hermeneutic approach makes more sense. Now, there's also a key point here where if you're doing a quantitative design or qualitative design, it doesn't matter. Okay, the approach is the same for either discussions or studies, but that's really when you get into methodologies and the research. It's the theoretical versus the conceptual, vastly different animal. The research literature review is the same. It's the same animal from that perspective. Okay, partly through my research, I think through one of the pre-presentations for the initial approval process of my research. One of the mentors that was, assisting in the assessment, he made a comment that in qualitative design, the literature reviews are weaker or smaller. And I because most of the bulk of the work is done post data collection, the explication process, and then the actual finalization, your findings, versus a quantitative where you do a lot of upfront work and then the research is done and then it's more minimal. I don't know if I agree with that kind of assessment of both processes, because what I found was during the qualitative process, the pre-coding, the research makes you prepared to understand what you get on the other side. So I think the approach for literature review is just the same for both, because it makes you that subject matter expert and then changes potentially your approach in chapter 3 and then actually your explication process. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to do, doing 2 demos as well during the course of this discussion. So, literature review primarily is a written argument that uses previous research to understand the unexplored research problem. Pretty obvious, right? It's what all the research that came before you that set the stage within the domain that you're researching or the multiple domains that you're trying to splice together. It's a lot of conflicting understandings of the nature and process. The process of locating and interpreting the literature for inclusion is unrefined. It's ultimately left to the judgment of the researcher. It's left to you. Literature reviews are comparable to a dance between reduction and reflection. I like that notion And it came from one of the hermeneutic authors, Dibley or, Van Manen or Caputo. I can't remember off the top of my head which one actually had stated that. But primarily, reduction is the simplification of the data, the distillation, and the reflections primarily your bias. What are you seeing from the past research, your own heuristic background, and that's really what it comes down to. All right. Now, in preparation, this is my approach, right? So buy a copy of MaxQDA. It's cheap. It's the best, thematic, qualitative software I've tried. I've tried all of them. I think it's very inexpensive for students, and I think it's intuitive. Love the product very much. Now, I use it even in quantitative design primarily for that same reason, because it's a place as a repository, as you'll see, of all the literature and a starting point of coding and the analysis of the literature. And it will help you with writing later research articles and other things you want to do postdoctorate. Get an electronic copy of most APA documents or whatever citation process you use. I find that it's good to go back to the actual source. And remember, APA does have a kind of a helpline for those kind of unusual questions. There's nothing against the stylists or anything like that at the university. What I found was each instructor has a different interpretation of APA 7. I'll use 7 as an example. And what it was that when they went through their doctoral program, they might have been an expert at APA 5. And they're still trying to apply the rules to now, and it's vastly changed. Whether you use footnotes or not, or, how you what do you include in the reference section? It's changed and augmented, especially as more electronic sources have came about. So always go back to the actual APA or the actual documents associated with your citation method, Chicago, Blue Book, Harvard, whatever that may be. All right. Grammarly is by minimum, the tool you use in Word, but I also want to mention that there is a tool from Scribindi in Canada that's AI. That's very exciting. It's very new. I love the folks at Scribindi. I'm not a paid advertiser. I've used them for years and years. Very valuable tool, especially if you have the same problems as most folks with writing. Mine was always run on sentences and some other grammar effects, but you get the picture here, right? You choose your citation reference tool. I use Mendeley, but you can use whatever you like, EndNote or whatever. Some kind of visual sticky note could be Visio. I like Miro. And then, of course, read the journal article called The Hermeneutic Approach for Conducting Literature Reviews and Literature Searches. It's by Bull and Cezes Kekmanovic. I so apologize for mispronouncing your names. Brilliant article. I love it. It was a great find for me and kind of set the tone of how I approach my literature reviews across all the research I'm doing now, including my research for work, not just academics. So there's the link. Read it. It's very thorough. All right, naming conventions. Before we go any further, it's really important with MaxQDA to have a standardized naming convention, and you have to decide on your approach. There's lots of books out there, and they all kind of mention this at one point, even the stuff from MaxQDA. But really, for me, it came down to name, date, and general reminder or domain. So, for example, it would be Tolbert 2022 and EI for, say, like emotional intelligence or something like that. And the reason is because if you have multiple works, like, say, Tolbert 2016, Tolbert 2012, when you sort them alphabetically, you get them all bunched together. And that's important because a lot of times the researchers that did the original publications build upon that original concept so you can see how it evolves over time. And that's actually kind of an exciting thing to add to literature review. If somebody specifically is a researcher for one domain that you follow, that's one of the key researchers, you actually get to detail their changes in opinion and research. It's very valuable, right? But it doesn't matter what naming convention you use. You just have to choose and decide what to do, right? Now, here is the baseline of the hermeneutic approach to literature reviews, right? So you have the search, initial ideas, sorting, selection, assessment, coding, refining, and repeat. Each one is a round of coding, right? And then it goes into literature review. So primarily each section, each round, search, analysis, interpretation, circular process. Now, here's what my literature review looked like through my dissertation, right? So I actually, again, I started doing this. I had 700 sources across 13 domains with over 5,000 codes within my literature review on its own merits, and 425 coded memos. The final dissertation, however, I ended up having 359 sources between 2017 and 22, and over 75% was from academic sources. Now, that's important to understand because each university has its own rule set as far as what you can use within your research, for publication or not, the ages, the types of sources. So don't forget that, because you'll have a major issue. Also, when the date changes, so is it the 5 years from the date of publication, or is it 5 years from the start of your research? It's important because during my process, I ended up having to dump like 100 sources because they were, almost at the end. I think I had some levity, the university granted me some leeway, but for the most part, don't get yourself bound. Understand the university rules and the start and stop dates of when they're valid or not. And I did a phenomenological design, so I had 300 initial population of interviewee candidates. I did 17 interviews. I actually did 32 interviews in reality, but 17 was used in actual research. Across 3 different groups of folks, and then 15 to 50 years of experience. And then the final dissertation, post-data explication, this is from the interviews. I had over 1,500 set codes from the interviews, 1,000 pages of transcripts, and 1,500 minutes of recording. And the reconciliation between the two was part of the data explication process, and I ended up with 15 specific themes coming from the interviews. Right, so I'm going to say this is kind of how this all works together, because practice and literature review also helps you with the practical expectations of your interviews and explication process if you're doing qualitative design. All right, the rounds. Like I said, it adds to your validation process in chapter 3. So warm up, where do you start? Right, so first things first is you already have an idea about where to start, right? You already created the research questions, right? That was one of the first things you did. Okay, so what gave you those ideas? You already have an idea about where to start. Okay, however, you could do a web journal crawl. I like to do, Google Scholar or any of the other ones. You don't have to go into the hardcore databases from universities or the ones that are, you don't have to spend any money yet. And there may be a case where you have to buy a journal because it's so important within the top 10 of your domain to get that access to that data. However, I'm kind of cheap and I don't necessarily like to pay for things if I absolutely have to. And sometimes you do. I think I dropped $150 through my dissertation just because I needed access to some articles I couldn't get by any other means, right? Key articles in your domain. And what you do is if you find 1 or 2 of the top researchers, generally their references start looking alike. So you start pinpointing, it's like, okay, these 5 sources have the same 5 references, and you start expanding your search to include them to see the larger gestalt and picture, right? And then, of course, pre-coding, right? And this is something that's not really discussed hardly at all. So if I have a research question I already crafted, and this starts with the round 1 stuff, so how do you get the codes to capture from the literature, right? So you say, okay, if this is the example question that I crafted for my research, what practical techniques can teachers use to better identify gifted children? It's a very good research question. I think the example I borrowed this from had a kind of a double barrel approach that I shortened, but primarily the first round of coding could be like gifted students. That could be a code. You could start there. These always evolve. So don't be afraid to start with bigger pieces, especially in round 1. Gifted students, the identification process, teaching techniques. So you have 3 codes there from 1 research question that you can start searching the literature for, right? And this is all part of the literature review, because what happens is it starts giving you a greater picture of, okay, then as I start an outline, I start putting this together. Okay, I might have, what teaching techniques that our educators taught in the university as a starting point. What did they learn, after the university, right? How do you find gifted students? What defines a gifted student? What's the characteristics? You guys get the point. And of course, your survey questions, if you're doing quantitative, you have a survey tool that you're already chosen, and that's really the baseline of your literature review starts with that survey tool, right? So if I'm doing emotional intelligence, I might use, Mayo's and that other guys, I can't remember the guy's name, that started it, and they created a tool, like there's 5 or 6 tools for that. And servant leadership, there's like 10 different tools, right? So if you choose a tool and is validated, that's part of the thing for an expedited 2-year doctoral program. So you're doing quantitative, you want to use one of these predefined tools, right? So if you choose that tool, it's created by a set of authors, researchers, and they already have a literature review to support the tool, and that's a starting point for your literature review as well, right? But from the questions of the survey, you can gather the pre-codes just like you can through your own research questions, and you should do them both, right? Just like your own interview questions. So if I'm doing qualitative and I'm doing a phenomenological design and I'm crafting, say, 20 questions, I already have a draft of those questions for the most part. What are the pre-codes of those questions? Because that's going to help me, because if I do the literature review based on those pre-codes and I start capturing all that data, when I actually complete my interview process and all that data and I do the explication, now I compare the two as part of the validation process. And that also goes into round 4, which, everybody knows there's 3 rounds, but technically there's round 4 we'll get to at the end. It's that reconciliation between the literature review and your data to make sure it's complete, to have the most complete research submitted as possible, right? Okay, in vivo coding, what is it? It's what the data tells you, right? So machine learning, which we all, what I do is I write some machine learning algorithms. It's not always what you think heuristically. That's why this approach made sense to me, because it's what the rich data set indicates. What's it show you? And sometimes it's shocking or surprising because you think, I might know this. But the reality is stuff just rises up. I don't like using the word emergent, because that's what Clark and Brown, they despise that word out of data, because things, like data doesn't emerge, right? So but it does concentrate. It does become more popular. It populates a concentration. So there's all of a sudden there's things that just keep coming up over and over again. And that's really what the in vivo is for. It's like, hey, I captured this bit of data that I read these 20 different journal articles. I started coding, but hey, this keeps coming up. Well, let's capture that in vivo. That's what the data is telling us to do. And it doesn't have to be what you assume it's supposed to be. And that's the most key part of this, is that it is something novel. And often it's surprising to you as a researcher to say, hey, this is great stuff. And that's something important. It's the whole point of research, right? So, all right. Round 1, just to start, you need some action. So the first thing is start dumping the literature PDFs into the theme folders you've created for MaxQDA. And you don't even have to have folders yet. You can just dump them all. And I'm going to do a demo at the end of this, and then you read code and write memos. Now, the memo process is very important because you start basically synthesizing the data that you're reading and starting to ask questions. Okay, well, why is a researcher here talking about all this stuff? And often it doesn't, you don't necessarily have to go back to the memo, but what you do have to do is it does give you kind of a feeling of, oh, hey, there's something I missed here, almost like a reverse case assessment of, I assumed it was supposed to have this, the author ignored it. But why did they ignore it versus these 2 other researchers on the same topic, but they have everything else and they included this as well, but this one researcher didn't? See what I'm saying? So, and then of course in vivo coding, let it happen. Then you start an outline either visually through the card process, so I'll show you a little bit later, or written, just a traditional outline, but it's up to you. But you want to start that because that's going to be the baseline of the round 2 where you actually start drafting. So, going back to our original example of gifted children, so one might be gifted children and then all the characteristics, identification, whatever, and that's one section of the research that's already been done previously. Right? Then you might have something about the education of teachers and there are pros and cons and all the literature associated with that. And of course, the codes grow and grow, and I'll show you that through the demo how elaborate the coding system I have for my baseline research database. Okay, all right. So here's the demo. All right, so here is the first demo. All right, so I went ahead and launched MaxQDA, as you can see. And I'm going to go ahead and open my main archive. All right. Okay, there it is. And remind me later. But you can see like an overview here of my documents. I actually have almost 6,500 documents, codes. In this particular database, I have a few different versions of this. And then you can see my specific code system, which encompasses primarily leadership in general. But we're going to go ahead and go through a generic naming convention first and how to search for it. So I've been researching the idea of Moore's Law, and we're just going to go ahead and search generically for Moore's Law. See as it comes up here. All right, there it is. And the very top hit under Google Scholar is an article from Schaller. Right, so I have all this. It's been cited 2,500 times. It looks like a pretty good idea of a starting point. Because it's, IEEE Spectrum, which is more of a magazine, but it gives us an idea about maybe the background, some other things to start researching this particular idea for the literature review. But you can see it has a PDF, which is great. So I download the PDF. I think I have so many things running. It's running us a little slowly here. All right, so I download it, not a big deal. I already have a copy of it, but boom, download. And you can either rename it here or later. I'll just go ahead and save it as this, and then delete this piece and move this around because I already have it here. So you can see I renamed it to Schaller 1997 AI. Now, to move this over into MaxQDA, I would just take it and drag it under my folder. See AIML, and I already have it there, so I'm not going to replicate it. But that's kind of what you do is you drag it in and dump it. All right, and then I double click it, and I'm already there. You can see the article populates under MaxQDA right here, Moore's Law, past, present, and future. Now, in the meantime, I go ahead and I want to go ahead and dump this into my reference tool. So I go to Mendeley and I search for it, Moore's Law, past, present, and future, and there it is, Moore's Law, past, future, Robert Schaller, 1997. There's DOI, and I hit Add to Library. All right, View in Library, so that one's done. And then if I go into my Mendeley tool, right here, and if I hit sync, there it is, Moore's Law, past, present, and future. So I click it, it says details are correct or search. I'm missing pages. Generally, I hit search. There it is. There's the pages. It comes up, and I hit details are correct, and now this is ready. I hit sync again because this also gets me ready to write anything if I want to write, so it means it syncs to the Word plugin as well. So, okay, so I'm done with that piece. Now, getting over here into the actual MaxQDA process, I'm there, and I'm going to start coding. And really what that looks for is, right now I just have the generic definition of Moore's Law. But as I search through this, I start asking myself questions. Okay, what else is there? Obviously Moore's Law was used in the semiconductor business, but maybe I want to create an in vivo code of alternative uses. Okay, and I put underneath Moore's Law. So when I get down here, Moore's law started out as a simple extrapolation from a simple observation, and has consistently been wrong. Okay, let's see. Moore's law stands out simple. Okay, so this continues the, how I got here was there's a lot of folks that talk about Moore's law going away because it's exponential versus logarithmic growth. And it has been shifting over time, and people use it specifically to say that there's always this great innovation of processes. But as you can see here, I went ahead and created a memo. So what other industries I can spell? Other applications use Moore's law to justify growth. Hence my overall question, which became in vivo a code, right? But then you can basically pull codes over. So I brought over AI as a linked code. But what I want to bring over here, alternatives here as well. So I want to bring that over, and I'm going to dump 2 codes into that actual memo. You guys get the picture. So you read, and then you basically, if we want to go any further, expectations matter beyond Moore's law. Okay, and this is kind of where we see the evolution of classes and components. But you read the whole article, and you start basically coding different things that might make sense within specific guidelines. And it could be one code, it could be dozens, it could be significant amounts. All right, but you kind of got to get the picture of how you start and go through this. You find the material, you dump it as a PDF, and you start actually going through it and then pulling it over just simply. So if I want to take this quote, let me do one quote here so you can see it. Beginning as a simple observation. I highlight it, then I bring it right over to the alternatives, and then I have a link of the code, right? And it goes away, and you hit it, it'll highlight it. Now, the next part of the demo, I'll show you where this goes into Miro, and how we actually start writing a draft. All right, back, round 2, start writing from the cards. Now, so collected the codes that make sense and dump into the sticky notes. Now, this is also a key piece because you start actually collecting the sections that go into that topic, that part of the outline, right? So you start writing your reflections as segmented themes, right? So synthesize, paraphrase. Now, when you're copying the codes, when you're coding, it codes the entire actual verbatim bit from the researcher. Now, obviously, we don't want to plagiarize, and we want to use that. But what does that reflect in us? So, synthesize, paraphrase. Be careful of direct quoting. Okay, this is one of the biggest hangups that me and some of the other researchers have as writers, and even proponents helping other students. Quoting is lazy, right? And at the doctoral level, you really do not want to quote anything unless it's so ridiculously important you have to include it, right? So 350 pages of my dissertation, I might have had 6 direct quotes, just to put that in perspective. So synthesize, paraphrase, do not quote anything unless it's absolutely necessary. Now, interview questions are different. When you get into chapter 4, you want to actually show the segments of interviews to justify your findings of that data explication. That's vastly different than the literature review, right? You don't want to include any quotes, and then don't ask and answer questions like euphorias, right? It's just being lazy. Write the questions and answers as statements or from the research. A literature review is not necessarily your interpretation as much as it is trying to illustrate everybody else. Now, your bias and your interpretation comes in a selection and comparisons between researchers. Now, you can add some questions that maybe everything will answer, but remember, you keep that very minimal because you're trying to set a picture and tone of all the research that went before you and not your own interpretations and stuff later. That's all chapter 5. Right. 4 is explication, just going through the data that you learned. And then chapter 5 becomes that part of that reconciliation between the literature review and your findings, right? Through your explication, right? Review what'd you miss, what becomes notable through the synthesis, still continue in vivo. Review your memos, write, and write some more. Remember, this is your drafting. You got to get it done. Don't procrastinate. Don't wait for that perfect moment. I got all the data. You're never going to have enough data. You're never going to have enough research, right? And what I found is it's just I think it's Krieger-Dunning effect. You know, you go into this thinking, man, I'm an expert at this. And by the end of this process, you realize how dumb you really are. You become an expert at this one specific segment, but the domains are so vast with so much academic research, it's ridiculous, right? So time for a second demo. All right, we're going to go ahead and start demo 2. So we're going to build on this. So right now, Schaller, who we dumped, has 2 codes in it, right? One is basically Moore's law, like origin, and the other one is uses. So I went ahead and launched Miro, which was the visual tool with sticky notes. So the idea here is I'm going to take the first code here, and I'm just going to copy it. And I'm going to go to Miro here, and I'm just going to pick a color, and I'm just going to dump it, Control V. And then I'm going to move it over into Moore's Law origin. Just doesn't have to be, it's just right here. And then the other code, I'm going to move down, and I know that it was something to do with alternative uses, so I'm going to copy that one, copy. And I'm going to pick another color, and I'm going to dump that one, paste. Right. Now, and I'm going to move that over to Moore's Law uses. So if I go up, let's take a picture, like a look at this more closely, the sticky note. Pretty much it's dumps as, I got to mess with the default, but less justify. And of course, it missed a letter, which happens. But more importantly, you have the actual exact quote, where it came from Schaller and page 5, right? It's important because MaxQDA does all that automatically, right? When you copy it. Now this one, of course, the justification is a little weirder. It happens again. So you just basically go and then you basically move it to the left. And you can see you captured some of the odd spacing. I'm sure there's a way to fix this. I haven't, sometimes I'm lazy. I just want to get it in there because remember, you're going to synthesize it and use it for your own purposes, which means you're not going to use this verbatim anyway. You're just going to use it as an idea of what Schaller was talking about as you start to write and draft. So basically that's kind of how this works. You see both of them here, and you keep building this until you feel it's completed. It could be, say, like 15 different ideas, and then you're able at that moment to start to write. So if I launch Word and I use something, just a blank piece here, maybe my first bullet would be Moore's Law origin. Then my second one would be alternative uses, right? So this is basically my subheadings, within the literature review. I'm just going to write and draft, and I'm going to use this from all the different sources that deal with Moore's Law origin. I'm going to dump into that section. And, once you have 5 or 6 sources and then they start sounding the same, is when you really need to kind of pull the plug and start writing. Because often you don't need as many sources as you want. You just want quality sources is the key, right? So, but go deeply because you may be shocked. And I also like the alternative domains where you can actually start looking at things outside. So shockingly, so what we're going to do here is there's another tool within MaxQDA I like, which is primarily analysis. So if I go to text search and autocode, and I'm going to clear all, and I just do Moore's, just like that. And I want to say in documents, place, I'm going to run the search. And you might be shocked that other documents you've already collected over quite a while already has a significant amount of Moore's law attached to it. And even other document groups. So and some of it's good, sometimes it's bad. You have to look at it like Moore's Rock Island group, not applicable. Moore's death of competition, yes, that actually is. Moore's weblog, no. Moore's law fetishizing the rest of package catch, yeah, that's from Jared Lanier. That's actually very applicable. It's under the AI ML already. But you can see that this pulls in all this data that you didn't necessarily code already, right? So if I look at Linear 2000, plenty of problems are overheads of scale are more steeply than Moore's law. Hugely capricious, faster than every minute's predicted by Moore's law. Okay, let's look at this one. Right, and yeah, there it is, Moore's law. So if you look at this whole unit, you can basically, maybe you would in vivo something here that talks about criticism. Criticism of Moore's law, hit OK, maybe you change the color to green, OK, and it's underneath Moore's law. So now you move this here to criticism. So now you copy, and we're doing the whole thing here back here. Maybe you're taking another one here, and you're pasting it. Text. So the codes become sometimes your pieces, and you move this over to criticism. As you can see, this starts to actually build your literature review very easily, right? And from various sources. And, you can fix this later, but you want to get this going where you have criticism, you have Moore's law uses, right? And it just keeps building, and you basically get this cross between the different components across multiple domains. That's why I like my database getting bigger and bigger, because I can focus on new documents specific to a research problem, but I'm shocked sometimes to see the overlap of other domains. And it's very encouraging. It brings a whole different picture as my database gets larger and larger from other areas of research. All right, so hopefully this gets you kind of started. Again, nothing's perfect. Just get writing. You got to have action, and you got to get moving on this. That's one of the biggest advice pieces you have, is you can't wait around for the data to basically be perfect. All right, round 3. Finish the review for now. Finalize the review your sources, use ReciteWorks, it's a great tool. Use Crossref, find those DOIs, the digital object identifiers. That's important. Review APA 7 or your citation method, because it's all important. Don't leave anything blank or by chance. Be very thorough with your reference section. Now, if you're doing ReciteWorks, what I do I add the references to the back end of just the literature review. So when you send it to ReciteWorks, it'll look at everything like it's a finished paper, and that's great because you can immediately check everything at that moment. You have to wait to the end, because then all of a sudden it becomes a major time crunch to get everything done at the last minute. Do it now. Do it at the end of the literature review, primarily before you turn it in, as a draft. And then I check for plagiarism. I check for plagiarism quite a bit throughout the process of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I use Turnitin, but I also use a second tool. I use Plagiarism Checker X, but always use 2. And the reason is Turnitin is incomplete to some web places, right? So if you scrape some stuff off the web, you got this and that. Sometimes Turnitin doesn't pick up all of that, but other checkers actually finds all of that. But you want to be thorough that it's your original work. That's another reason you don't do the quotes and other things. You'll see it, because every quote you do will come up on Turnitin or the other checker tools, right? All right, round 4. And this is at the end. Okay, I'm done with chapter 4. I'm done with chapter 5. Now round 4 of the literature review comes back is the reconciliation between your entire work and the literature review itself. What did you miss? Did you come up on something that wasn't part of the literature review? You're kind of obligated as a researcher to go back and add it because you want to complete work, right? It could be something that you need to amend. It could be something minor. It could be stuff that you have to delete because it absolutely wasn't applicable, but during your process of pre-coding and everything else, it was. Right? Maybe, and then what you do is you go back and redocument that. There's nothing says that in chapter 5, as you're crafting chapter 5, that you can't go back to chapter 2 and fix something, right? There's no rules that say that or not, right? But actually, you're somewhat obligated as a researcher to go back and make it complete, right? So did you capture the key concerns and the previous research? That's really an important question as well, right? So, okay, well, that's it. Hope everybody has a great time with this. I'll include my email if you have any questions. All right. Thank you very much.